Welcome to BFR Radio, a podcast dedicated to all things blood flow restriction training. This podcast is proudly sponsored by the BFR.co, where if you want to buy your own BFR cuffs, access online BFR training programs, or you want more information about this type of training, this is your one place to go. And I'm your host, Dr. Chris Gavilio. Welcome back to this episode of BFR Radio. In this series, we've been looking at how we can use BFR to assist with injuries. When I started the series, it was really relevant because it coincided with the end of season surgeries that athletes typically go through with the conclusion of the football season. And after the last two episodes where I focused just on the ACL, I was initially going to move on to another focus area. But after having a few conversations with some coaches going through ACL injury rehab with their athletes, I thought I'd squeeze one more episode out. If you remember the last two episodes, and in particular part 2, I referenced the Melbourne ACL Rehab Guide. This is a free downloadable guide that has a fantastic criteria-driven ACL rehab protocol. Part 1, which coincided with phase 1 of the ACL Rehab Guide, was all about preparing and optimizing recovery from surgery. And part 2 in this series coincided with phase 2, and this was all about gaining back the strength and neuromuscular control in the knee and in the lower limb. For this episode, we're going to cover phase 3 and 4 of the rehab process. If we refer to the Melbourne ACL Rehab Guide, phase 3 of the ACL Rehab Protocol sees a return to running, change of direction, jumping and hopping, as well as the continuation of a gym-based strength and neuromuscular program. The three most important goals of phase 3 are, firstly, attain excellent hopping performance, that's through technique, distance, and also endurance. 2, progress successively through an agility or change of direction program and modified gameplay. And thirdly, regain full strength and balance. In simple terms, if the athlete cannot run smoothly, hop confidently, and change direction without hesitation, they're not ready to think about sport just yet. The key physical themes include ensuring that the tendons and muscles have the appropriate elastic strength and stiffness to tolerate rapid loading, especially during hopping and deceleration. Other key themes in phase 3 include single leg dominance, which almost all meaningful tasks in this phase are single leg, and other key themes include fatigue tolerance. The guide explicitly tests movement, both fresh and fatigue, recognizing injury risk increases late in effort when the athlete's a little bit more fatigued. Objective benchmarks used in this phase include a hop test symmetry, where you want to genuinely achieve 95% or greater compared to the uninjured limb, dynamic balance tasks performed at speed under fatigue, and strength levels approaching or exceeding pre-injury benchmarks. For example, in the guide, they include a goal of a 1.8 times body weight squat. So stage 3 is a filter, not yet a green light. Athletes who look strong but move poorly are identified here. Those who pass the stage demonstrate not just capacity, but movement trust. Then we move on to phase 4, and this is return to sport. It should be highly individualized, and exercises and training activities that are usual for the athlete when not injured should be integrated here. Focus should not only be on getting the knee ready for sport, but the whole person. The knee needs to be stable and strong with optimal neuromuscular patterning and biomechanics. But the athlete needs to be confident and mentally ready to return to sport. And this will come from repetition of successful training and match play situations. The guide suggests to allow athletes back to sport if they have satisfied 3 key criteria. The first is that they score greater than 95 on the Melbourne Return to Sport score, which integrates a combination of knee stability, swelling and range, strength and hop testing, psychological readiness, and also functional performance across multiple planes and speeds. Secondly, that the athlete is comfortable, confident, and eager to return to sport as measured by specific questionnaires. And thirdly, an ACL injury prevention program is discussed, implemented, and continued whilst the athlete is participating in sport. Furthermore, to lower the risk of future injury, Evidence supports that injury prevention programs are performed at least 15 minutes prior to each training session and game. Hence, this would be strongly suggested to continue from phase 4 onwards for the rest of their sporting career. Now that we've framed phase 3 and 4 of the Melbourne ACL Rehab Guide, the key question becomes, how can BFR play a role here? For this episode, I want to walk through a series of applied concepts that are a requirement in both of these phases, of which I'm going to support each by a BFR intervention study. The aim here is to show how BFR can evolve from a rehab tool into a performance and load management strategy. To cover these concepts, some of the BFR studies may not be ACL studies per se, rather highlights how they can be used to effect. And by phase 3, a lot of athletes have quite a level of good function. Therefore, when we look at these BFR studies, most of the participants are healthy, and in comparison to those athletes undergoing a good ACL rehab program, they're actually probably at a similar level or not far off to those that are covered in the studies. For this podcast, I'm going to cover 6 concepts, or rather 6 studies. And to prevent this episode going on for too long, I'll pick out the main concepts, protocols, and results. The ultimate goal is for you to get the idea of how BFR can be applied in different ways. I'll put the article references in the show notes as well, in case you want to dig into them a little bit further. Let's get started. To start off phase 3, we're no longer protecting a knee in isolation. Rather, we're rebuilding running mechanics, hopping capacity, change of direction ability, and fatigue tolerance. Strength is no longer the limiting factor on its own. Instead, it is how that strength is expressed under speed, complexity, and fatigue. One of the defining challenges of phase 3 ACL rehabilitation is restoring single leg control under dynamic conditions. This includes the ability to accept load, stabilize the knee, and maintain movement quality during single leg tasks such as hopping, landing, and deceleration. A useful study here is by Jung and colleagues, which examine the effects of rehabilitation exercise with and without BFR following ACL reconstruction. This is perhaps one of the only ACL-specific articles that I'm going to review. The participants completed a 12-week rehab program, training 3 times a week. The rehabilitation program included a combination of closed and open chain lower limb exercises such as squats, calf raises, leg extension, and hamstring leg curl, as well as gait retraining, single leg balance, and control drills. In the BFR group, the cuff pressure was set at 40% of limb occlusion pressure and was increased 10 millimeters of mercury every 2 weeks. The loads were low, ranging from 10 to 30% of their 1RM, and for the strength exercises, they performed the 75 rep protocol. In comparison, the non-BFR group performed exactly the same exercise program, except that they did 3 sets of 15 repetitions. In brief, both training groups showed improvements in knee function scores, muscle strength, and overall physical function, which is what we'd expect from a well-designed rehab program. But when you look at the difference in the results between the 2 groups, the group percentage change for muscular strength and endurance testing in both the hamstring and quadriceps was considerably larger in favor of the BFR group and was anywhere between double up to 7 times better. One test that I do want to highlight is the result for dynamic balance, assessed using the Y balance test. For those unfamiliar, the Y balance test is a single leg dynamic balance assessment in which the athlete maintains single leg stance whilst reaching in 3 directions, forwards, diagonally backwards, in both directions, kind of like a Y with the free limb. It's widely used in ACL rehab and also in other movement screening tests because it integrates postural control, neuromuscular coordination, and also strength. From a scoring perspective, each reach direction is measured as the maximum distance reached whilst maintaining balance on that single leg stance leg. A composite score is then calculated by taking the best measurement from the 3 reach directions, providing a global indicator of dynamic balance performance. In ACL rehab, clinicians often focus not only on absolute improvements, but also on side-to-side symmetry. In the study, both groups improved, but the BFR group improved more. Specifically, the BFR group demonstrated significantly greater increases in reach distance across all three directions, resulting in a larger improvement in individual and composite Y balance score compared to the non-BFR group. The magnitude improvement in the BFR group was approximately 7 to 9.4% when you compare all three directions, whereas in the non-BFR group, they demonstrated a more modest improvement closer to 2 to 6% depending on the direction. This suggests that adding BFR to strength-based exercises transferred to better single leg control and dynamic balance performance, exactly the qualities being screened during Phase 3 ACL rehab. Phase 3 is not only about maximal force production, it is about repeatability of effort. Athletes must tolerate multiple hops, repeated accelerations, and sustained agility demands without a breakdown in technique. And to build on this, we'll look at the second study, which is by Sousa, Neto, and colleagues, and they looked at how BFR influences local muscular endurance. In this study, healthy participants trained 2 times per week for 6 weeks, performing machine-based leg extension exercises under 4 different conditions, or rather 4 different training groups. The first was a high-intensity training group where they trained at 80% of 1RM. Then there was a low-intensity training group where they trained at 30% of their 1RM. Then there was a low-intensity plus BFR where they used 30% of 1RM, but they wore the BFR cuffs. They also had a combined training group where they alternated training sessions where one session was performed using the high-intensity 80% of 1RM, and then the next session was performed with low intensity wearing the BFR cuffs. All of the participants trained using only one leg, their dominant leg, and in each of the different training groups, they performed 4 sets to concentric failure. That's irrespective of whether they used 30% or 80% of 1RM. For the BFR groups, the cuffs, they were quite wide at 18 centimeters and inflated to 80% of arterial occlusion, and they remain inflated throughout the working sets. In terms of outcomes, the authors assessed a range of neuromuscular variables, including maximal strength, muscle activation, and local muscular endurance. Across these measures, all groups demonstrated some degree of improvement, which again is what we would expect following a structured resistance training program. Maximal strength tended to improve most in the high-intensity group, while the combined group showed more moderate gains across both strength and endurance outcomes. These findings reinforce the idea that traditional heavy loading still remains the most effective stimulus for maximal force production. However, the outcome most relevant to this Phase 3 discussion was local muscular endurance. Endurance was assessed by having the participants perform as many repetitions as possible at a fixed submaximal load. And overall, every training method led to improvements, but some approaches stood out more than others. The researchers measured these changes using something called effect size, which is a way of showing how big the improvement was. And this is what they found. Firstly, the high-intensity training group came out on top with an effect size of 27.5, which is considered a very large improvement. Close behind was the low-intensity training with BFR, and this had an effect size of 26.1, also a huge gain. The low-intensity training on its own wasn't far behind, scoring 22.7, and the combined approach, mixing high-intensity with low-intensity BFR, showed a strong effect size at 19.3. So what does this mean in plain terms? If you want to improve muscular endurance, all these methods work really well, but high-intensity training and low-intensity with BFR seems to give you the biggest bang for your buck. Low-intensity training without BFR is still effective if you can't go heavy or you can't use BFR. And the combined approach, whilst helpful, doesn't seem to add extra benefits compared to sticking with just one method. From a practical perspective, this tells us 2 important things. First, performing muscular endurance training with BFR clearly works, even when external loads are low. Second, although athletes in Phase 3 are typically progressing to higher loads in their main strength work, these results suggest that adding a short BFR-based endurance exercise at the end of the strength session may be a time-efficient and energy-efficient strategy for targeting fatigue resistance in athletes who still need to develop this quality. While it remains technically unproven whether combining BFR with higher external loads would further enhance endurance outcomes, the data does support the strategic use of low-load BFR endurance work as a complementary tool, rather than a replacement for traditional strength training during this phase of rehab. When we read the Melbourne ACL Rehab Guide in Phase 3, it also places a strong emphasis on elastic strength and stiffness, particularly for hopping and deceleration tasks. As a result, the calf Achilles complex is an important area to train during ACL rehab. There's a great study which examines whether low-load BFR training could induce Achilles tendon adaptations comparable to traditional heavy loading. I've actually covered this article in detail in a previous podcast episode, but I feel it fits nicely here and it's worth briefly revisiting. For the study, participants completed a 14-week training program using 2 exercises, a standing and a sitting calf raise. The 2 intervention groups were firstly a heavy load training group using loads of 70 to 85% of 1RM and 3 sets of 6 to 12 repetitions. And their second group was a low load training group where they performed the 75 rep protocol at 20 to 35% of 1RM whilst wearing BFR on the thighs. Despite the lower external loads, the BFR group demonstrated substantial tendon adaptations. Achilles tendon stiffness increased by approximately 36% compared with 41% in the heavy load group, while tendon cross-sectional area increased by 7.8% with BFR, exceeding the 4.6 increase observed with the heavy loading group. Strength measures of the gastroc muscle and plantar flexor strength also significantly improved in both groups. These findings provide evidence that BFR can have a positive effect on distal musculature, such as the calf Achilles complex. While this Achilles study did not examine the use of BFR with higher external loads, it is reasonable to hypothesize that it would be worthwhile for an athlete to train at higher loads with BFR. And even if you did still perform low-load BFR calf strength exercises during Phase 3, this again represents a time-efficient and energy-efficient strategy, particularly when athletes are already performing higher load strength work elsewhere in the weekly training programs. Moving on to another key concept is running. And this is a defining milestone in Phase 3 ACL rehabilitation. Yet early running volumes are often constrained by knee tolerance rather than cardiovascular capacity. A particularly relevant study here is by Chen and colleagues, who examined the effects of combining running training with BFR in trained endurance athletes over an 8-week intervention. In this study, athletes trained 3 times a week and completed 5 bouts of 3-minute running, separated by 1-minute rest periods on a treadmill. The running intensity was set at 50% of heart rate reserve, and the running speed was carefully matched between groups, averaging at approximately 10 to 11 kilometers per hour. The only difference was the use of BFR cuffs worn on the thighs. The running intensity at 50% of heart rate reserve was a submaximal intensity, typically corresponding to a steady aerobic pace rather than high speed or sprint running. Now, to briefly explain what heart rate reserve means in simple terms, heart rate reserve is the difference between an athlete's maximum heart rate and their resting heart rate. Training at 50% of heart rate reserve therefore represents a more moderate aerobic intensity and is calculated by taking half of that heart rate range and adding it back onto the resting heart rate. This allows intensity to be individualized rather than prescribing a one-size-fits-all pace. In the BFR condition, the cuffs were worn on the thighs and was inflated to 1.3 times resting systolic blood pressure, and they remain inflated continuously throughout the running bouts and the rest periods. Despite the identical external running demands, the addition of BFR led to clear differences in the internal physiological stress. Specifically, BFR running resulted in higher heart rate responses, typically several percentage points higher than the non-BFR running at the same speed, as well as higher ratings of perceived exertion. However, it's the changes in physical performance and physiology that is of importance here. Across the 8-week program, the BFR group improved their aerobic capacity as measured by VO2 max by approximately 5.1%, compared to a decrease of 1% in the non-BFR running-only group. The BFR group also demonstrated greater improvements in knee extensor strength, increasing by approximately 17%, compared with an approximate 6% decrease in the non-BFR group. Importantly, these adaptations occurred without increases in running speed or volume, indicating that BFR elevated the internal training stimulus without increasing joint loading. And just really briefly here, when reviewing a lot of these aerobic-based BFR training studies, it's quite amazing that doing some kind of cardiovascular work with cuffs on also has improvements in lower body strength as well. I just find that absolutely amazing. So from a stage 3 ACL rehabilitation perspective, this suggests that BFR can be used as a bridging tool during running reintroduction. It allows coaches to increase cardiovascular demand, muscular fatigue, and neuromuscular stimulus at relatively slow running speeds, which is particularly valuable when the knee can tolerate running mechanics, but not at the higher velocities or volumes. By late phase 3 and into phase 4, according to the Melbourne ACL guide, athletes are typically lifting at loads closer to normal training, often 70% of 1RM or higher. I've reviewed in previous podcasts the advantages of using BFR for moderate to high loads. These studies focus primarily on barbell velocity, but in this phase, we're rather looking at developing strength capacity. To highlight this, I'm going to briefly mention another study that I've covered in a previous podcast episode. It's by Cook and colleagues, who examined the effects of adding BFR to moderate load resistance training in trained rugby athletes. The participants trained 3 times a week for 3 weeks, performing 3 exercises, that's back squats, bench press, and pull-ups. All exercises were completed for 5 sets of 5 reps at 70% of 1RM. In the BFR condition, the cuffs were applied to the thighs at a pressure of 180 millimeters of mercury and inflated during the working sets and released during rest periods. Another important thing that I also need to highlight is that even when performing the 2 upper body exercises, the BFR cuffs were still worn on the thighs using that same inflation protocol. After just 3 weeks, the BFR group demonstrated greater improvements across several performance outcomes. Squat strength increased by approximately 7.8 kilos in the BFR group, compared with only 4.3 in the non-BFR group, alongside substantial greater gains in leg power. Interestingly, upper body bench press 1RM strength increased more in the BFR group, despite the cuffs being worn on the thighs rather than the arms. In addition, the BFR group showed significant improvements in 40-meter sprint time, whereas sprint performance was largely unchanged in the non-BFR group. The authors also reported favorable hormonal responses in the BFR condition, including greater acute elevations in anabolic hormones, most notably testosterone. From a rehab and performance perspective, this is relevant because testosterone plays a key role in muscle protein synthesis and neuromuscular adaptation, all of which become increasingly important during the later stage of ACL rehab when training loads and performance demands are increasing. These findings indicate that BFR can enhance strength and power adaptations even when training loads are already relatively high, using a moderately heavy load, supporting its use during the transition from rehab to full performance training. This also takes the pressure off having to push that higher end of the percentage RM spectrum when lifting, as well as giving the athletes time to adapt to their training program. As athletes transition into phase 4, the focus shifts away from isolated physical qualities and towards sport-specific performance under realistic conditions. At this stage, the goal is no longer simply to demonstrate capacity in controlled tests, but to express strength, speed, and endurance within the chaotic, decision-rich environment of sport. Small-sided games play a key role in this phase because they naturally integrate running, change of direction, acceleration, deceleration, reactive decision-making, and fatigue tolerance, all within a context that closely mirrors competition. They also allow coaches to manipulate intensity, space, and work-to-rest ratios whilst maintaining high engagement and sports relevance. Against this backdrop, the application of BFR during small-sided games provides an interesting example of how BFR may extend beyond rehab and into performance preparation during this phase. To illustrate this, I want to highlight a study which examined the effects of applying BFR during 3-on-3 basketball small-sided games. In this training study, 24 well-trained college basketball players completed 8 small-sided game sessions over 4 weeks, training twice per week. Each session consisted of 4 sets of 3 to 4.5 minutes of gameplay with 3-minute rest between sets. There was 2 groups, obviously. Firstly was the BFR group. They wore 10-centimeter cuffs on the thighs, and the inflation pressure progressed from 100% to 130% of estimated leg systolic blood pressure, with the cuffs inflated during the play and deflated during the rest periods. Estimated leg systolic blood pressure was calculated as 1.2 times arm systolic blood pressure. Looking at the testing results, the BFR group demonstrated a number of clear performance advantages over not wearing BFR. Firstly, peak aerobic power, that's VO2 peak, increased by 9.5% in the BFR group compared with 4.6% in the control group. Repeated sprintability improved in the BFR group, demonstrated by faster mean sprint times and reduced sprint performance decrement across repeated efforts, whereas the control group showed a worsening of repeated sprintability, becoming slower over successive sprints. Anaerobic power, which was assessed by a 30-second Wingate maximal cycling sprint test, this improved in the BFR group with a 4.6% increase in mean power output, while the control group showed no meaningful change. And lastly, explosive lower body performance improved only in the BFR group, with a 6.8% increase in counter movement jump height, compared with no improvement in the non-BFR group. Importantly, the Melbourne ACL Rehab Guide also emphasises the ongoing use of a 15-minute pre-training or pre-competition injury prevention program once the athlete has returned to sport. This represents an ideal opportunity to integrate BFR in a targeted and more effective manner. When applied in a short activation style session, pre-training or competition, the addition of BFR will help amplify the desired outcome by increasing muscle activation, potentially reducing joint or tendon discomfort in athletes who may be experiencing ongoing symptoms, and also create a favorable internal training environment before training or competition. Used strategically, BFR can transition seamlessly from early rehab into running reintroduction, strength training, small-sided games, and pre-training activation or injury prevention sessions. An additional and exciting benefit of this approach is the potential to acutely elevate anabolic hormone concentrations, such as testosterone. Some other benefits of increases in acute levels of testosterone in the body have been associated not only with improvements in strength, speed, and power, but also with behavioral factors such as motivation, determination, and competitive readiness, all of which are highly relevant in the return to sport environment. In doing so, it supports the ultimate goal of ACL rehab, not just as a return to sport, but a return to robust, repeatable, and confident performance. So to bring this episode to a close, phase 3 and phase 4 are really where BFR stops being viewed as a purely rehabilitative tool and starts to be viewed as a performance and preparation strategy. At this point in the process, the athlete is no longer fragile, but they're still adapting and they're still accumulating load. What the studies we've discussed today show is that BFR can be used in multiple ways across these 2 phases. Importantly, None of this suggests that BFR replaces traditional training. Instead, it offers a way to layer additional stimulus onto existing programs in a time-efficient, energy-efficient, and joint-friendly manner. If you're working with athletes coming back from ACL reconstruction, my suggestion is to think less about when BFR stops and more about how its role changes across the rehab performance continuum. And that's where we'll leave this episode. And also, this brings the 3-part ACL series to a close. If you have any questions related to this, you can get in touch with me through my website, which is www.thebfr.co, or my socials at thebfr.co. You can also purchase your own BFR cuffs from our website. And lastly, before I go, a couple of favors from me to you. If you know of someone who would benefit from this episode, please share it. And if you are enjoying the podcast, please give it a rating on iTunes. Thanks for listening, and remember to keep the pump.